What if I told you time travel was never meant for us? That every step we take through time tears reality apart, and now it's collapsing. Right now, and the only person who can stop it might have to erase herself from existence. This isn't science fiction. This is happening, and time is running out. The world had changed. By 2157, time was no longer a mystery. It was a tool. A dangerous, volatile, and heavily controlled tool. 5 years ago, humanity unlocked the secret of time travel. Not in the way of science fiction, with swirling blue portals or silver-clad explorers stepping through glowing gateways. No, this was colder, more clinical. A breakthrough achieved in a high-tech laboratory, buried deep beneath the Eastern Alliance's most advanced research facility, the Quantum Time Research Center, TNTQ. The discovery should have been a triumph, a beacon of human ingenuity. But time doesn't like to be controlled. It resists, and now the fractures were beginning to show. The world was split. On one side, the Global Time Council, enforcing rigid laws to prevent reckless interference. On the other, factions who saw time travel as a means to power, profit, and even war. And somewhere in between, caught in the storm of science and philosophy, was Hera Klinus. Hera wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a soldier. She was something else. A philosopher, yes, but also something more. She had spent her life studying time, not in equations or cold data, but in meaning, in patterns, in whispers that most people never noticed. She didn't belong here inside the steel and glass labyrinth of TNTQ, where everything was calculated, measured, and reduced to numbers. Yet, she was here, because last night something had changed. Something had gone wrong. A sudden call, a forgotten past. She stood at the edge of the research center's massive observation deck, looking down at the heart of the facility, the Kronos 7, the world's most powerful time machine, a massive, spiraling construct, pulsing with an eerie blue light, surrounded by levels of steel catwalks and a dozen security drones hovering like silent sentinels. It was beautiful, terrifying. Hera, a voice cut through the cold silence. She turned. Brain, the man who had built all of this, genius, visionary, manipulator. His sharp, calculating eyes studied her as if he were analyzing data points rather than a person. "You got my message," he said. I almost ignored it. Brain exhaled sharply, the closest thing to a laugh he was capable of. And yet, here you are. Hera crossed her arms, feeling the familiar weight of her past pressing against her ribs. "I don't work for you, Brain." "No, you don't," he admitted. "But you might be the only person who can stop this." She tensed. She had spent years trying to forget, trying to outrun the nightmare of what happened 3 years ago. The accident, the man she lost. And now, the past was clawing its way back. Below them, the Kronos 7 flickered. For a moment, just a brief moment, Hera felt something shift. A ripple in the air, like a memory struggling to take shape. And then, she heard his voice, a voice that should have been lost in time. Marcus. Her breath hitched. Brain was still talking, but she wasn't listening anymore. Somewhere, deep in the heart of time itself, something had broken. and it was calling her name. The alarms screamed, a sharp, piercing wail that cut through the sterile air of the Quantum Time Research Center like a knife. Red warning lights strobed across the towering walls of the Kronos 7 chamber, casting jagged shadows on the steel catwalks above. Hera barely had time to react before the room shook. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floor beneath her boots, and suddenly, the machine came alive. Kronos 7 wasn't supposed to activate. It wasn't even fully operational yet, but now, the spiraling rings at its core began to rotate slow at first, then faster, until they blurred into a vortex of shimmering light. The temperature in the chamber dropped, and the air rippled, distorting like heat waves on asphalt. And then, the first tear appeared, a gaping rift not in the machine, not in the facility, but in time itself. It was a jagged, twisting rupture, suspended in the air, its edges flickering like broken glass catching the light. Inside it, flashes of something else. Another time, another place. Hera took a step back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She wasn't the only one who saw it. "Oh, hell no, Igor," one of the senior physicists staggered back. His tablet slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the steel floor. A second rift split open across the room, then another. The air fractured, like a mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces. Time itself was breaking apart, the time echo. And then it happened. A figure emerged from the first rift. Hera's heart stopped. He stepped forward, his outline flickering, his form unstable, as if he were caught between existence and oblivion. His face was shadowed at first, but then, for just a second, the light caught him. Her lungs seized. Marcus. Her Marcus. He was standing there, looking right at her. His dark eyes held that same quiet intensity, the way they always did when he was lost in thought. His hair was tousled, his uniform slightly rumpled, exactly as he had been the last time she saw him. 3 years ago. But that wasn't possible. He was dead. Hera. His voice was distant, layered like an echo trapped in a canyon. "You have to stop this. It's coming." Her vision blurred. Her body swayed. This wasn't real, but she could feel him. The warmth of his presence, the weight of his voice. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her instincts screaming at her to run to him, but before she could move, the rift twisted, the image of Marcus distorting like static on an old television screen. Then he was gone. Hera choked on a breath, a sharp stab of loss cutting through her like a blade. No. The floor beneath her rumbled. More rifts were forming, spiraling out of control, opening up across the chamber. Through them, shadows of the past bled into the present. In one tear, she saw war, soldiers marching beneath a sky on fire. In another, a future not yet written, where the TNTQ tower lay in ruins. And in another, herself, standing in a place she didn't recognize, eyes glowing with something ancient. The arrival of Hoakin. Then the world went silent. A sudden, unnatural hush fell over the chamber, the alarms fading into a muted hum. The rifts stopped pulsing, as if something or someone had seized control. A presence filled the space, not loud, not forceful, but inevitable. And then she was there, Hoakin. She stepped through time as though it was nothing but a thin veil, appearing at the center of the chaos with the weight of 1,000 years in her gaze. The swirling rifts cast ghostly reflections across her porcelain skin, her dark eyes calm too calm. Hera Clinus. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it resonated everywhere. Hera turned, her body still trembling, her mind still reeling from what she had just seen. Who, what? Her throat was raw. What the hell is happening? Kin tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. The point of convergence, she murmured. It has begun. Hera's pulse pounded against her ribs. What does that mean? Kin looked at the spiraling fractures around them, at the disjointed pieces of time slipping through the cracks, and then she met Hera's gaze. It means, she said softly, time is collapsing. The lower levels of TNTQ were never meant to be accessed. Even the official records listed them as decommissioned old storage units, obsolete tech, a forgotten relic of early time travel research. That was a lie. Hera knew it the moment the hidden door slid open. A rush of stale metallic air hit her face, carrying the weight of something long buried. The hallway beyond was dark, untouched, its walls lined with rusted conduits and flickering emergency lights. This place isn't abandoned, Igor muttered, adjusting his scanner. There's still power running through these circuits. Suzanne, their lead data analyst, swept her flashlight across the corridor. No one's been down here in years, but this whole system is still online. She frowned at her handheld device. That shouldn't be possible. Hera said nothing. She just stared into the shadows ahead, her pulse hammering in her ears. Something was waiting for them down here. She could feel it. They moved deeper into the underground sector, passing through layers of old security systems, biometric scanners overridden, passcodes long forgotten. And then, at the very end of the corridor, they found it. A massive, reinforced door, unmarked, no insignia, no access logs. Brain had erased its existence from the database, but not from time. Inside the lab of ghosts, the door groaned as it slid open, revealing a laboratory frozen in time. Old monitors hummed faintly. Stacks of physical documents, an anomaly in this digital age, were scattered across tables, their pages yellowed and curling at the edges. But the centerpiece of the room, the thing that made Hera's breath hitch, was the machine. It was smaller than Krona 7, older, cruder, a prototype, and next to it, a stasis chamber, empty. Holy shit, Suzanne whispered, running her fingers over the control panel. This isn't just another time travel experiment. This is... Hera turned sharply. A containment unit. Igor swore under his breath. For what? No one had an answer. Not yet. Hera moved toward the old computer terminal, dust swirling in the dim light. She pressed a few keys. The system was old, but still functional. The screen flickered, then files began to load hidden records, long buried beneath layers of encryption. And that's when they saw it. The footage, dated 10 years ago. The grainy video feed showed the lab exactly as it was now, except for one crucial difference. There were people in the room, and at the center of it all, standing where she stood now, was Brain, the experiment that shouldn't have happened. Hera leaned in, her hands gripping the console. The recording played out like a nightmare unfolding in real time. Brain stood in front of the old time machine, younger, but with the same cold precision in his eyes. He was speaking to someone just out of frame. We're ready to begin. Initiate phase 1. A group of scientists scrambled around him, activating controls, adjusting parameters. The machine began to hum, its core glowing with an unstable golden light, different from the smooth, calculated energy of Cronus 7. It looked wrong, and then the chamber in the background activated. Hera's stomach twisted as she saw who was inside it. A man, mid-30s, strapped in, unconscious. The feed crackled. The camera zoomed in, and Hera's blood turned to ice. Marcus. She staggered back from the console, her breath ragged. No, this wasn't possible. Her mind screamed that she was seeing things, that it had to be someone else. But she knew. The experiment wasn't just about time travel. It was something worse. The machine activated, and Marcus began to convulse. The energy surrounding him flickered, his body phasing in and out, caught between time states. The scientists panicked, alarms blaring. Then the screen glitched, and when the feed resumed, the chamber was empty. Marcus was gone, but the machine was still running. And Brain, he was smiling. The truth no one was supposed to know. The video cut out. Silence filled the room. Hera's hands curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. He knew, she whispered. Her voice was shaking. He knew this entire time. Susanne was pale. Hera, I don't think this was just a failed test. I think this is how the fracture started. Igor pointed at the system logs. Look at the timestamps. These anomalies, these time distortions, they began the day of this experiment. Hera turned away from the screen, her chest heaving. This wasn't just an accident. This was a cover-up. Brain had broken time itself. And Marcus, he wasn't dead. He was lost in time. The corridors of TNTQ's restricted sector were eerily silent. The only sound was the faint hum of distant machinery and the rhythmic tapping of Hera's boots against the cold metal floor. The further they descended, the heavier the air became, charged with something unseen, something ancient. Ahead of her, the door to room 0 loomed. No security panels, no keypads, just an impenetrable wall of obsidian metal, smooth and unmarked, as if it had existed outside of time itself. This place shouldn't exist, Igor muttered, gripping his tablet tightly. His eyes darted nervously toward Susanne, who was already running diagnostics on the strange material. Not according to any blueprints, not even in the classified files. It exists, Hera murmured, her voice distant, her fingertips tracing the cold surface of the door. And whatever's inside, it's been waiting. And then it happened. A pulse rippled through her, not in her skin, not in her bones, but in something deeper, something woven into the very core of her existence. The air around her flickered, like light refracting through water. A flash, a different hallway, the same walls, but older, the air thick with dust, shadows stretching unnaturally long, the echoes of voices that no longer belonged to this moment. Another flash, the world snapped back to the present. She stumbled, gasping. Susanne caught her. Hera, what the hell was that? Hera's hands trembled. She had seen the past, not remembered it, not imagined it. She had been there. No machine, no calculations, just her. Brain stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. You phased, he said, his voice tight. You just crossed time without a machine. Silence. Igor exhaled sharply. That's impossible. No. The voice that answered wasn't Hera's. Joaquin. She emerged from the shadows, her movements impossibly fluid, her gaze settling on Hera like a weight she had carried for centuries. "It is not impossible," Hokin said softly. "It is who she is, the truth of Room Zero." The door unlocked itself. With a deep, mechanical groan, the ancient structure shifted, revealing a passage beyond. Dim blue light pulsed from within, illuminating something vast, something older than any known civilization. They stepped inside. In the center of the chamber stood a monolithic structure, unlike anything human hands could have built. A time machine, but not like Cronus 7. No wires, no screens, no human engineering. It was alive. Glowing inscriptions spiraled along its surface, shifting and rearranging as if aware of their presence. And across the chamber walls, symbols identical to the ones etched onto Hera's skin. Her breath caught. No. Her fingers brushed over the markings on her wrist, then up to the faint lines at the nape of her neck. She had lived with them her whole life, never knowing what they meant. Just scars, just birthmarks, just something unexplained. Now she knew better. "These symbols," she whispered, voice barely holding together. "They're the same as—" "They are not symbols," Hokin interrupted. "They are a map. And you, Hera Clinus, you are the key." Silence crushed the room. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her heart pounded. No, this wasn't real. She swallowed, shaking her head. "I'm just a time walker," Ho-Kin finished. "One of the last, one of the only." Hera felt the ground sway beneath her feet. Time walker. The words settled into her bones like a forgotten melody, like something she had always known but never understood. The flickers of déjà vu, the visions, the way time had always felt closer to her than it did to anyone else. She hadn't been seeing time breaking. She had been feeling it. "This isn't a discovery," Hokin continued, stepping toward her. "This is a return. The truth was never hidden from you, Hera, only waiting for you to remember." The light from the machine pulsed brighter, resonating with the ink on Hera's skin. The symbols burned with recognition, a whisper of something awakening. And in that moment, she knew. She hadn't been brought here by accident. She had been meant to find this place, meant to find herself. And now, the past, the present, the very fabric of time itself was calling her to step forward. The world was coming apart, time fractured like shattered glass, its edges slicing through reality, the chamber around them warped 1 second. It was the gleaming, sterile heart of TNTQ. The next, it was ancient, crumbling ruins, then a battlefield, then a city that had never existed. The past, the future, the forgotten all colliding, spiraling toward annihilation. And at the center of it all, Cronus 7 pulsed wildly, its energy surging beyond control, feeding the chaos instead of stabilizing it. The machine had become the rupture. Hera stood before it, her breath shallow, heart hammering against her ribs. The realization was a weight pressing down on her chest, crushing, suffocating. There was only one way to stop this. "You knew," she whispered, voice raw. "You always knew." Brain stood across from her, the chaos flickering around them, his expression unreadable. His hands trembled at his sides, not in fear, but in something else. "Regret." "Hera," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Don't." She took a step forward, fists clenched. No more half-truths, no more manipulation. "Just tell me." Her voice broke, then steadied. What did you do? The floor beneath them shuddered, cracks splitting through time itself. In the air, ghostly echoes flickered fragments of lives that never were, memories from futures that had yet to exist. And then she saw him, Marcus, not an echo, not a fragment, him. Hera's breath caught in her throat. He stood just beyond the swirling fractures, reaching for her, his eyes filled with something between love and sorrow. Real, and yet not, because he shouldn't be here, because he had never left that machine. Her pulse roared in her ears. She turned back to Brain, her voice barely a whisper. What did you do? Brain exhaled, the last shred of his composure fracturing, and then he told her the truth. I had no choice, he said. The machine, it was never meant to work, not without a catalyst. He swallowed hard, not without him. The words cut through her. Her knees nearly buckled. No, I had to stabilize the sequence. And Marcus. Brain's voice was barely audible now. His DNA, his existence, was the only thing that could bridge the gaps between timelines. Hera staggered back, as if she'd been struck. Her mind reeled, struggling to breathe, to think, to accept. You used him. The words barely made it past her lips. Her Marcus, the man she had loved, the man she had mourned he hadn't died in an accident. Brain had taken him. The realization hit like fire in her veins. You took him, she said again, sharper this time, the rage surging through her like a wave, drowning out everything else. You used him like some kind of fuel? Hera, please. No, she snapped. Don't you dare beg me for understanding. Marcus was trapped inside time itself. He had been part of the machine all along. Every flicker, every anomaly, every whisper she had heard, it was him, reaching out, trying to find his way back. And now she had a choice. Let the collapse continue, or sacrifice herself to repair what had been broken. Her hands shook. The symbols along her arms glowed faintly, responding to the energy around her, to the machine calling her name. Time wanted her. She could feel it in her bones, in her blood. Her entire life had led to this moment. She took a breath, a deep, shaking breath, and then she stepped forward, toward the machine, toward the end, or the beginning. The last sacrifice. The machine roared. A vortex of light and energy spun wildly at the heart of Cronus 7, devouring what was left of time's stability. The fractures in reality had widened, dozens of them, spreading like deep wounds across existence. Through the rifts, pasts and futures, bled together wars that had never happened, civilizations that had never risen, faces of people who had never been born. It was all collapsing, and Hera knew this was the moment. She stood at the core of it all, her body pulsing with energy, the ancient symbols on her arms glowing with the same eerie light as the machine. Time was speaking to her, calling her. There was no running now. There was no denying who she was. She turned to Joaquin, who stood still, watching her with knowing eyes. The celestial presence that had once felt untouchable now seemed fragile, fading. This was always the path, Joaquin murmured. Hera swallowed hard. And you knew? I did. She smiled soft, sad. I was only ever a placeholder, Hera, a guide. But time does not need a guide. It needs a guardian. The words sank into Hera's bones. She clenched her fists, steadying herself as the realization hit with full force. She wasn't just here to fix the timeline. She was here to become something else, something eternal. Brain's redemption. A sudden explosion of energy sent sparks raining down across the catwalk. The chamber shook, and from the wreckage, a figure stumbled forward. Brain. Blood streaked the side of his face. His lab coat was torn. His hands burned from trying to override the failing system, but still he moved. Still he fought. Hera, he gasped, gripping the edge of the control panel. His voice was hoarse, strained. There's still another way. You don't have to. I do. She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. He knew she was right, and yet he shook his head. I can't let you do this. She stepped toward the core, the energy wrapping around her like a living force. It's not your choice, Brain. But before she could move further, he did. With a burst of motion, Brain lunged forward and slammed his hand onto the emergency override. Red warnings flashed across every screen, a high-pitched alarm blaring in protest. Hera's eyes widened. No, Brain, stop. Too late. The system reacted instantly. He had locked her out of the sacrifice. He turned back, offering her a broken smile. I started this, he whispered. Let me end it. And then the light consumed him. A blinding pulse of energy exploded outward, ripping through the fractures, sealing them shut one by one. Brain stood in the heart of it, his body unraveling, dissolving into time itself. Hera reached for him, but he was already gone. A last whisper of his voice echoed through the collapsing chamber. Fix what I broke, Hera. Then silence, becoming time. The machine stabilized, its core pulsing steadily, absorbing the chaos. The fractures were gone, the timeline slowly knitting itself back together. But Hera wasn't done. The energy from Cronus 7 still called to her, wrapping around her skin, coursing through her blood. It wasn't just closing the wounds of time, it was choosing her. She took a shaky breath, and then she let go. She stepped fully into the light, her body dissolving into something more, something infinite. The symbols on her arms burned bright, merging with the very fabric of time itself. She felt everything at once, past, present, future, not as separate moments, but as a single, flowing existence. She understood. She had become the guardian. The last thing she saw before the light swallowed her completely was Joaquin smiling, a look of peace in her eyes. And then, just like that, Joaquin was gone, her purpose fulfilled. And Hera was reborn, not as a scientist, not as a philosopher, but as something greater, something eternal, the keeper of time, the new order of time. The world did not end. It had come close, too close, but time had been pulled back from the brink. The fractures were sealed. The echoes of lost realities faded into silence. And for the first time in years, the universe was at peace. But peace is never the end. It is only a beginning. The birth of the Time Walker Academy. The Quantum Time Research Center was no more. What had once been a place of secrets, of hidden experiments and dangerous ambitions, had been reborn not as a laboratory, but as an academy, a place not to manipulate time, but to understand it. They called it the Time Walker Academy, a sanctuary for those who could sense time's flow, the few who had been touched by its mysteries. Some were scientists, some were philosophers, others were just ordinary people who had seen too much, felt too much, and could never go back to a normal life. Suzanne and Igor led its first council, working together to create something new, a way to monitor time, to protect it, to make sure no one would ever abuse its power again. They designed safeguards, new ethical codes, a watchtower across time to track anomalies before they could spiral into destruction. But even they knew this was just the beginning, because there were still whispers, still ripples in the fabric of reality. And no one, not even the Academy, fully understood what Hera had become, or if she was still watching, a visitor from the future one evening, long after the last of the sun had disappeared behind the skyline. Epictetus stood alone in the central hall of the Academy, staring at the towering glass panels that overlooked the city. The past few months had been a blur, rebuilding, restructuring, redefining everything they thought they knew. The work never stopped, and yet something still felt unfinished. The air in the room shifted. It was subtle, just a flicker, a ripple in the stillness, the faintest hum of energy that did not belong. Epictetus turned and froze. There, standing at the entrance of the hall, was a woman, tall, unshaken, a presence that commanded the room without a word. Her features were unmistakable, the sharp gaze, the quiet strength, the weight of knowledge far beyond this moment. But the glow in her eyes, that was new. She took a slow step forward, the light of the city reflecting off the edges of her figure, as if time itself bent around her. "Who are you?" Epictetus asked, even though he already knew. The woman smiled, just slightly. And then, with a voice laced with centuries of wisdom, she said, "You already know the answer." And in that moment, Epictetus understood. Hera had returned, or perhaps she had never truly left. Time is no longer just a concept, it's a battlefield. And Hera, she's just taken her first step into the unknown. But what happens next? What secrets are still buried in time? And most importantly, would you risk everything to fix what was broken? Drop a comment below. What would you do if you had the power to rewrite history? Hit like if you want to see what's next. Share this if you think time travel should never be controlled. Because this is just the beginning.